Now, if I mention influential drug dealers, two names will pop into your head: Pablo Escobar and El Chapo. Escobar was obviously the classic drug lord, but in the 1980s, the giant Colombian cartels were forced to change their complex trafficking routes. That's where El Chapo comes in. Mexico was the obvious partner for the Colombians. Why? Location, of course. With Mexico right on the doorstep of the US, there was no better place to be if you wanted to sell tons of drugs. And that's how the Mexican Sinaloa cartel rose to the top, and El Chapo became one of the most successful drug lords of all time. But where is all that drug money today? Let's see if we can find out. Now let's face it, drug dealers are pretty sneaky. You don't become successful doing illegal business if you're easy to find. That means it's pretty hard to know just how much money El Chapo actually made in his time as a cartel boss. We do know he was selling cocaine, meth, heroin and weed by the ton in America. Soon he expanded to multiple countries around the world, and when I say tons, I mean it. Of course, tons of drugs means tons of cash, right? Forbes had Joaquin Guzman, that's El Chapo's real name, listed as one of the world's wealthiest people from the years 2009 to 2013. Currently, they estimate he's worth $1 billion, but that really is just an estimate. Because his operation was so underground, there are definitely no invoices or tax records that would tell us how much cash he earned. Everyone seems to have a different answer. His lawyers and wife insist that he's not worth very much at all. His lawyers even said he had a few money problems. But let's face it, we'd all say that if we were trying to defend one of the biggest drug dealers of all time. We know for a fact that El Chapo's son owned, or at least used to own, a $200,000 sports car, so you can bet El Chapo was worth more than they say. Some other sources put his net worth at a mind-blowing $12.6 billion. That could be possible. Some people think Escobar was worth around $30 billion in his prime. So if El Chapo was half as successful as Escobar, then $12 billion is about right. And there was a lot of money floating around El Chapo's cartel. The Mexican army once pulled over a car only to discover $15.3 million in cash just sitting inside it. And it sure looked like the car belonged to El Chapo. And he even bragged that he had a fleet of airplanes, submarines, boats and trucks, all transporting drugs for him. So although we don't know the exact number, we know he can be pretty sure he had crazy amounts of cash. So where is it? That's the billion-dollar question. After a 6-month-long manhunt and a super successful raid, El Chapo was caught by US officials in 2016, and they've been hunting down his fortune ever since, with no luck. Of course, we all imagine drug lords hiding their money in the dirt out in the middle of the desert, or maybe in the walls of very normal-looking houses. At this time, his indictment had a value of $14 billion placed on it. Now, some people call this a fantasy. Authorities had just guessed that number based on the amount of drugs they knew he'd sold. But how do you even start looking for a hidden stash of $14 billion? The authorities seemed pretty sure that he hadn't simply buried that amount of cash in a Mexican desert. Just imagine the size of the hole you need to dig to hide all that cash. They were also pretty sure that he didn't have a secret bank account in Panama holding it all. So they decided to start looking for legitimate businesses that might have been bought with El Chapo's drug money. This is one clever method that people like El Chapo used to make their shady cash legal. He wasn't the only one involved in the underground business world. Last year, his wife, Emma Coronel Aispuro, was also arrested and documents were found proving that she manages El Chapo's funds. She openly admitted that she owns a lot of farms, which she said aren't illegal at all. But that doesn't mean they weren't bought with money that was earned selling drugs. But it doesn't have to be farms. Anything from sports team to shopping malls would work for this type of money laundering. Apparently, El Chapo also spent loads of cash on things like super yachts, mansions, and a collection of private planes that are all apparently filled with piles of cash. During his trial, a lot was revealed about El Chapo, including the private zoo at his home and his collection of jewel-encrusted guns. All these purchases are another way to hide drug money, and maybe prosecutors could have even proved that they were bought with cash earned illegally. Except there was one problem. Investigators can't look into anything that El Chapo purchased in Mexico. That's gotta hurt, right? You can bet El Chapo knew this too. He wasn't stupid enough to put himself in harm's way by paying for a diamond-studded gun in America when he could easily get one over the border. So it looks like what happens in Mexico stays in Mexico. If you're wondering why the Mexican authorities are pretending to know nothing about all this, there's a pretty simple answer. They were willing to turn a blind eye because of the huge amounts of cash El Chapo was giving to charity while also investing in things like sports. We'll probably never know how much drug money is tied up in these luxury items. But according to investigators, there were other purchases made in the US. One investigator suggested that members of the cartel would come to the US with credit cards already loaded with cash. Apparently, they used those credit cards to make huge purchases, like loads of high-end computers, which they take back to Mexico. That way, the illegal money would be left in the US, while the now legal items were back in Mexico. Two wives of ex-cartel members also came forward with stories of how huge amounts of cash were carried through America to places in Mexico they called stash houses. They said that, once it was there, they'd use counting machines to count the cash and then neatly package it all afterward. Apparently, they counted millions this way, but there's no sign of any of it. Then again, there's one way that other cartel leaders have been hiding cash that might surprise you. They simply use a bank. HSBC got itself into a bit of hot water when this was discovered. Just a few years ago, the British bank was forced to admit that they'd been helping both Mexican and Colombian drug dealers to launder billions. It was a surprisingly simple operation. Cartel members would show up with hundreds of thousands of dollars and just deposit it into a single account. Just like any of us did it, but with much bigger sums of money. The bank seemed to work on a no questions asked policy. So what were these accounts they were depositing drug money into? They're bank accounts owned by shell companies, which are exactly what they sound like, businesses that are just empty shells. Basically, they're nothing more than names set up to make it look like the crazy amounts of cash are owned by large companies, when in reality, the company doesn't really exist. Most rich people, from celebrities and sports stars to government and the British royal family, all have offshore accounts like those. And by the way, HSBC wasn't punished for helping major drug dealers to launder their legal money that way. Anyone who might have been able to bring criminal charges against them was too worried that the case might cause the collapse of the bank, which might have threatened the financial system on a worldwide scale. Instead of having to face the music, the bank simply apologized. They said they wouldn't give any bonuses for a while and settled to the tune of $1.9 billion, which sounds like a lot of money until you realize that it's a major bank handing over a very small percentage of their earnings. There's no way of knowing if El Chapo was using that method to put his cash offshore, but there's also no reason to think he wasn't. If he was, it would be pretty difficult to find any of that money now. And that's kind of the point. He didn't want anyone to be able to find it. So far, he's done a pretty good job of that, because 6 years after he was brought in by American authorities, they're still no closer to finding El Chapo's secret billions. So, do you think you can guess where all the drug money is hidden? Tell us in the comments and give us a like. Now, don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss another mind-blowing story like this one.